Welcome to Rica Subtest 3 online test preparation course presented by ricatest.com. Thank you so much for joining us in this lesson. You will learn everything that you need to know about competency number 2, covering the purposes and best practices of reading assessments. There are 3 types of reading assessments you'll need to know for your Rica test. These include entry-level assessments, monitoring of progress assessments, and summative assessments. Let's look at each individually. Entry level assessments are given to students before a lesson or unit begins. The entry level assessments help indicate which students will need more support. Let's look at a specific example. A third grade teacher will teach a series of lessons to help meet the third grade reading standard of determining the central message of a story and explaining the key details from the text. Before she begins teaching this skill, she should give her students an entry level assessment to determine which students have already acquired this skill. In order to give the entry level assessment, this teacher asks her students to read a short story and write the central message of the story using details from the story. This assessment allows the teacher to understand which students have already achieved the standard and, most importantly, which students will need extra support. The second type of assessment is called the monitoring of progress assessment. This is an informal assessment, meaning we use the spoken form, not writing, and this is given to students in the middle of a lesson. Here, the teacher reads aloud a story to her students. Suddenly, the teacher comes upon an important part of the story. She stops and asks a comprehension checking question, such as, "What message is the author trying to say here?" But instead of one student answering, she instructs the students to think, pair, share, where the students take a moment to think about their answer. And as they think of an answer, they show the teacher a thumbs up. Then the teacher says, "Pair, share," and the students turn and talk with the partner sitting next to them. During the monitoring of progress assessment, the teacher closely observes and listens to the conversations while checking for student understanding. The teacher may not be able to hear every response from this question, so the teacher will ask multiple comprehension checking questions throughout the read aloud as part of her monitoring of progress assessment. The monitoring of progress assessment indicates which students are making adequate progress toward meeting the standard being taught. The third type of assessment is the summative assessment. These are formal, standards based assessments given at the end of a lesson, unit, semester, or even year. And these are used to determine whether students have achieved the standard that was being taught. Next, let's discuss alternative assessments. And there are 2 main types of documents covered on the Rica test for children whose learning requires additional support. The first is the Individualized Education Program, also known as the IEP, and the second is the Section 504 plan. Let's discuss the differences now. First, on the IEP, this is for a child who is unable to make progress within a regular classroom setting. This person can receive an IEP. The criteria for receiving an IEP can be any of the following: a child who experiences or who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism, cognitive challenges, developmental delays, emotional disorders, hearing problems, learning problems, physical disabilities, speech or language impairment, or vision problems. If a child does not meet the criteria to receive an IEP, yet has an identified disability, the student may be granted a Section 504 plan so that the child can receive academic success and equal access to the learning environment and materials. Next, and most importantly for your Rica test, is how to differentiate assessments for students with special needs. Each student's IEP or Section 504 plan is truly individual, and a teacher needs to read and follow the specifications laid out in the written document. Assessment differentiation options include providing students with additional time to finish, dividing the assessment into smaller units, changing the mode of delivery, such as from written to spoken, and provide practice assessments. In this next section, you'll learn about the two quality indicators that apply to standardized assessments. The first being reliability, which is when the same test produces consistent scores over time. The next is validity, which is the degree that the test actually measures what it claims to measure. Standardized tests usually follow at least one or more of these scoring systems, which include percentile scores, grade equivalent scores, or Stanine scores. Percentile scores use 50% as what's considered an average score. That means if a student receives a percentile score of 87, their raw test score is 87% higher than the sample group of students who took the same test. A grade equivalent score converts a student's raw score to a school grade level. The end result will be a decimal point, such as 4.3, and this would mean that the student's score placed her at the fourth grade level in the third month of the academic year. Next, we have Stanine score. This is the scoring system where a 9 is the top score, 1 is the lowest score, and 5 is considered the average. Using the Stanine score, a student's raw test score is converted into a number and placed between numbers 1 to 9. In this next section, you'll learn how to interpret the results of assessments in order to determine whether a student is performing below, at, or above the expected level of performance. Teachers collect and analyze assessment data in order to determine which students have and have not yet met the standard being taught within these three categories: below expectations, meeting expectations, or exceeding expectations. Students whose assessment indicates a below expectations result means that the student has not yet met the standard. The second result is meeting the standard. In this case, the student's assessment results indicates that he or she has met the standard. And finally, we have exceeding the standard, which through analysis of the assessment results indicate that this student's skill has not only met, but also exceeded the standard. Keep in mind that your Rica Test scorers want you to understand that teachers do not haphazardly create lessons. Instead, they create lessons systematically through the results they collect based on student assessments. Furthermore, these student assessments are used to create individual student profiles, which show whether the student has scored below, at, or exceeding expectations. Then, the teacher takes the individual profile to create the class profile, which also includes the standards taught to show how effective the instruction and activities have been in teaching the whole class. Based on the profiles, the teacher then uses the data to systematically plan effective reading instruction, where the teacher can adjust instruction and provide differentiated instruction to meet the needs of all individual learners, and ultimately reassess to determine whether the relevant standards have been met. Next, in this section, you will learn how to determine students' independent, instructional, and frustration reading levels. Teachers determine students' reading levels using informal reading inventories, word recognition lists, graded reading passages, where an informal reading inventory is a running collection of assessments that acts as a portfolio of reading achievement for each individual student in order to indicate the student's reading level. The important note about informal reading inventories is that each student will have a unique portfolio of assessments based on their reading skill and ability. The next type of assessment used to determine students' reading levels is called a word recognition list, which provides the teacher with the child's sight word vocabulary knowledge and ability to decode words based on their sound to symbol relationship. Graded reading passages are also called running records, where the teacher chooses a passage and the student reads it aloud. During this time, the teacher is listening as the child reads aloud, and the teacher is keeping a detailed record of the student's performance, marking errors and looking for patterns of mistake. Now, let's go over a few key terms you can expect to see on your Rica test. Mis-cue analysis is the process of analyzing a student's oral reading to help identify a student's areas of strength and need so that the teacher can provide data-based instruction, knowing which skills are most important for that student to work on. For example, this student demonstrated difficulty differentiating simple present and simple past tense. Here we have grapheme error. This is an error caused by a child reading slowly on a word by word basis, which tells us that the student is relying too heavily on looking at the phonics to try and decode the word. The most common culprit in this case would be that the text that the student is reading is too challenging for the student. The next term related to this topic is semantic errors. This is a meaning related error, such as when a student reads cat for pet. Here, the writing is unrelated, but the meaning is related. In this case, it would mean that the student is using her correct comprehension of the story, but isn't using her phonics skills enough. The last term we'll cover here is called syntactic errors, which is the order or sequence of the language written or spoken. Reading errors in syntax might include, for example, apple my, instead of reading my apple. In order to determine if a reading passage is too easy, too difficult, or just right, the teacher will ask the student comprehension checking questions based on the story read during the running record assessment. These questions are supplied to the teacher for each story. The answers that the student gives will provide insight that helps the teacher determine if this text passage is the correct level for this student. Let's define the three different reading levels now. Books at a student's independent reading level can be read and understood without help from the teacher. A student's independent reading level is reached when the student reads a passage aloud with 95% or more words read correctly and answers 90% or more of the comprehension questions correctly. Next is the instructional reading level, and this is the level of material that the student can listen to and understand, and also read with direct support from the teacher. This level is lower than the independent reading level, and it's the level that the content area texts, such as science and social studies, should be at for the student. The instructional reading level is reached when a student correctly reads aloud 90% or more of the words and answers at least 60% of the comprehension questions correctly. A student's frustration reading level is reached when fluency and comprehension are both lost, even with help from the teacher. The frustration reading level is defined when a student cannot correctly read aloud at least 90% of the words or answer at least 60% of the comprehension questions. Quick to note, a teacher needs these two things to accurately determine a student's instructional and independent reading level. The teacher will calculate first the percentage of words that the child can correctly read aloud, and second, the percentage of comprehension questions the child correctly answers. In this next section, you will learn strategies for communicating assessment results and reading progress to students, parents, guardians, and relevant school and district personnel. Students should be kept in the loop with the results of their assessments. They should specifically know which standards they have met and which they haven't met yet, and also which they have exceeded. When discussing a student's reading progress, avoid general language like, she's doing great, and focus on language that targets reading standards, such as Amy's ability to decode words with the digraph CH, SH, TH, and NG exceeds expectations. Her results show that she has met the standard for decoding digraphs OA and OE, but has not yet mastered OR and UR. Continuing with communication to parents, conferences are often held at least twice a year at most schools. However, for our struggling readers, English learners, and advanced learners, teachers will most effectively promote and support these students by holding conferences with these parents more regularly. Communication with school district officials often follows and requires certain protocol. Ask your team lead or university professor for help. Competency 2 covered the purposes of reading assessments and the best practices related to assessments. Before we leave, let's recap the key takeaways from this lesson. First, we started by learning all about the three types of reading assessments and their purposes. The first is the entry level assessment, which is given prior to instruction and used to determine which students already possess the skills needed to understand the standard that will be taught in the upcoming lesson or unit. Second, we have the monitoring of progress assessment, which is given during an instructional unit or lesson. And this helps the teacher determine which students are progressing adequately toward achieving the standards. And third, we have the summative assessment, which is given at the end of a lesson or unit in order to determine whether students have achieved the standard. Then you learned about the key factors of alternative assessments. These include IEPs and Section 504 plans, where the important point to remember for your Rica test is that each student's learning plan is unique, and it is crucial for a teacher to read the student's plan and adhere to learning supports that the student is granted to receive. For your Rica test, make sure to look back at your notes from this lesson and be able to identify and describe terms such as validity and reliability, and to be able to describe the different scoring systems, including percentile scores, grade equivalent scores, and Stanine scores. Remember that a student's assessment scores are what a teacher uses to analyze the benchmark score that is given to each student, whether that is has not yet met the standard, is meeting the standard, or is exceeding the standard. For your Rica test, make sure to be able to identify the scores needed for students that will put them at the independent reading level, instructional reading level, and frustration reading level. Remember also that students should be kept in the loop about how their reading is going. Teachers can and should use a variety of communication methods to communicate both to parents and to students. Teachers can hold conferences, make a phone call, send an email, or write a note home. Remember that if a student lives in a home where English is a second language, try to find someone to help translate the message into the family's native language. Thank you so much for watching this Rica test prep video. When you're ready, go ahead, take the competency number 2 quiz to check your understanding for this test material, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.